Today we are going to be going over what console players can expect in the 1.0 Risk of Rain 2 update. This update comes with a bunch of sweeping changes to just about everything, so you're going to want to watch the entire video. Trust me, there are item changes, a new gameplay update, new survivors, a boss, everything like that. You're going to want to see it all. And right before we get into the video, I want to remind you to subscribe if you're not already subscribed. I would really appreciate it. So let's start with the major gameplay changes. First and foremost, we have a new ending to the game. Instead of just obliterating yourself on Monsoon, you can now go to a final boss and actually beat Risk of Rain 2. Upon beating said boss, you unlock the newest survivor in the game, Captain. Now I have two guides for this, one for unlocking the Captain, one for actually playing the Captain. And if you really want to get funky, I have a guide for how to unlock all of Captain's loadouts. Basically, if you want to play the Captain, I have you covered. Just check out the top right. We'll talk more about Mithrix and the Captain later on in this video, but we're going to be mainly talking about the gameplay changes right now. Another major game mechanic that has been changed is bleeds. Bleeds now refresh all existing bleeds on that target, meaning that you can have essentially infinite bleed. Whereas before, you could get maybe 3 or 4 stacks of bleed on a monster and only do a little bit of damage. You can now refresh that bleed on the enemy and get over hundreds and hundreds of stacks of bleed. Although by the time you get hundreds and hundreds of stacks of bleed, you're probably going to kill the enemy. This will change item priority and has buffed several of the items that were previously not so good. Another major change is the increased difficulty rate across all difficulties. So if you've played Risk of Rain 2 for any amount of time, you'll know that the game gets harder as the game progresses. Every second, monsters are increasing in strength, damage, health, everything. Well, in the 1.0 update, the increased difficulty rate is now increased by 10%. The reason for this being is that this update was supposed to give players a lot of choice over their builds and not as random as it used to be. So you can expect to see a lot more difficult enemies earlier on. And of course, the later it goes, the more difficult it's going to be. Next, they reworked one-shot protection. This is a major, giganto change. So before the Risk of Rain 2 1.0 update, lots of people ran shaped glass. There was basically no reason not to run shaped glass. This is because even though you had half health, maybe even like 100 health and like 1600% damage, you still couldn't get one shot because of one-shot protection. However, now in the 1.0 update, the one-shot protection threshold is affected by curses. A curse being anything that reduces your health permanently, essentially. So this means that shaped glass is no longer going to give you one-shot protection. If you go below the 90% threshold because of a curse, so shaped glass taking away 50% of your health is always going to guarantee that you will not have one-shot protection, just with one stack. There are other curses as well, so if you take a spinal tonic, I believe it's called, and you get the tonic affliction and it reduces your health below 10%, you will also not have one-shot protection. This isn't the first time that one-shot protection has been changed. Barrier used to give you another layer of one-shot protection, so to speak, but then they nerfed that as well. However, it's not just a nerf, they also buffed it a bit. So if anyone remembers, wisps shoot 2 projectiles instead of 1, which means one-shot protection basically will never work against a wisp. Because if they do one-shot you, it's because their first shot hits you and put you below the threshold, and then their second shot finish you off. It basically happens on the same frame, so there's no way of really telling, it just looks like a one-shot. Well, the new OSP logic, or one-shot protection, is buffed so that that will no longer happen. You probably won't notice it as much, but still, it's there. Next, elites have been changed a little bit. So the elites have been nerfed quite a bit. From glacial, blazing, and overloading, their health bonus has decreased by 70%, so they are now only at 400% extra health. Malachite and Celestine are now only 1800% down from 2350%. This was a change intended to decrease the health pools of the elites because they were kind of bloated, as the developers said, which essentially makes the old guillotine mandatory. This change was to make it so that survivors don't have to rely on old guillotine that often. They did make a change to the old guillotine as well, but I'll talk about that in the item section. And for the last part of the major gameplay changes, some survivor mobility skills and melee skills have been improved. Mobility skills are now considered sprinting, scaling with sprint speed multipliers, and also sprinting after use. This means that goat hooves and energy drinks will increase your mobility with your sprinting abilities, quote unquote, just your mobility abilities in general. And for melee survivors, melee skills will now perform more consistently at high attack speeds. Melee skills will now scale hit pause duration with attack speed. Previously, if you've ever played a melee survivor, which sorry if you ever have, you will know that there is a pause between attacks. This is essentially your animation or your backswing. If you've ever played a MOBA or anything like that, you'll be pretty acquainted with these things. You usually do some animation canceling so you can attack quicker. Ranged survivors don't have this, and melee survivors do have this, but they have no way of canceling the animation. This means attack speed is always going to be better on ranged survivors than it is melee survivors. To change this, melee survivors now have their hit pause or animation improved with attack speed. So the attack speed is going to be a lot better on melee skills now. Okay, so that is the general gameplay changes. Let's now talk about Mithrix, because this will lead into the next section. So for starters, you're going to want to know how to get to Mithrix. This starts with Stage 5. Stage 5 now no longer has a normal teleporter, but it has a primordial teleporter. This primordial teleporter can either take you to Mithrix or take you to your next loop. This is because Mithrix will end the game and you can no longer play that run anymore. So they give you an option to either continue the run or go fight Mithrix. If you choose to skip Mithrix, you can always fight him again once you get to Stage 5 again, which will be Stage 10 or whatever. And you'll always be able to go back and fight Mithrix if you haven't done him yet. The way that you can choose between Mithrix and going to the next loop is by going to the primordial teleporter and interacting with these spikes outside the ring. Once the chat box says the teleporter is now aligned with the planet, you go on to the next loop, and if it says the teleporter is aligned with the moon, that means you're going to Mithrix. Okay, so now we can talk about the moon, which is basically where you go after Stage 5. Granted that you chose to go fight Mithrix. The moon is a very long stretch. It seems kind of like a highway. This highway leads you to 2 other islands and Mithrix itself. The island on the right being Lunar Pod Landing. I call it that myself. I have no idea what it's called. But it has a bunch of lunar pods that you can open for lunar items. On the left, we have Soup Island. This island basically just has a bunch of soups, just like the soups you find in the Bazaar Between Worlds. It is risky to go over there, however, because the only way out is to either have enough jumps to be able to get back onto the platform in the highway so you can go back to Mithrix, or by jumping off towards the highway and landing on there when the fall damage teleports you on top of it. There used to be a bug on PC when the game first came out where you would be permastuck on Soup Island, which it gained the name of Permastuck Island from. However, I'm sure that they will probably have patched that by now and they won't add it into the console update. Unless, of course, they want to be inclusive and allow you guys to, feel that rage. Just keep in mind that the only way you're going to be getting out of Soup Island is by jumping off the cliff. And finally, we have the last location on the moon, and this is Mithrix's arena. There will be little boosters you can take to fly up to the arena, and you will be stuck here for the rest of the fight. You'll notice kind of like a black ball in the center. That's where Mithrix spawns, and you'll have to wait for his little spawn animation. Once he spawns, you begin the fight. Now, this fight has 4 phases. Phase 1 being the initial fight. All you have to do, shoot Mithrix, hit Mithrix, and avoid getting hit by Mithrix. He does a butt ton of damage. Second phase, you're going to be dealing with his lackeys. You've probably already seen these on the highway. These are the ground chimera and the flying chimera. The ground chimera aren't really that threatening as long as you keep moving, while the flying chimera have this constant machine gun attack that slowly pecks you down, and a secret hidden move called the Bendy Ball of Doom that can curve mid-air and is pretty difficult to dodge if you don't understand it's coming. This ball deals a lot of damage, so whenever you see a ball coming towards you, dodge it, or if you have enough damage, you can actually destroy it. Regardless, in this phase, you're going to have to destroy all of these things, and then the next phase will begin. Once that's done, you have phase 3. In phase 3, you're fighting Mithrix and sometimes ground chimera. Mithrix is a lot stronger and a lot faster in this phase with a whole bunch of new movesets. One such moveset is the revolving door attack, where you have to avoid getting hit by essentially revolving doors. I don't know what else to call them. This attack does a lot of damage, and if you're hit by 2, usually that means you're going to die. There's another attack where he slams the ground and spikes come at you. This attack also hurts a lot, so avoid it at all costs. Once you manage to kill Mithrix in this phase, you go into phase 4. A lot of people do not like this phase because in phase 4, Mithrix actually steals all of your items, and he now has them. The only way to get your items back is to do damage to Mithrix, and you will slowly get your items back in reverse order of which you acquired them. So the first item you got in your run is going to be the last item you get, while the last item that you have is going to be the first item you get. There are a couple items that Mithrix cannot use, such as teddy bears and razor wire, I think it is. but for the most part, he can use almost every single one of your items. In this phase, Mithrix is relatively easy to kill. You just have to dodge the balls on the ground, which is kind of hard to do, but he has much less health than he used to, and he won't move or do any damage to you outside of the balls and his needle gun attack. Once you kill him in phase 4, now you have to do something which I suppose is technically phase 5. This is escaping the moon. Now remember the highway that you took to get to Mithrix? You now have to take that all the way back and you will get on a ship. This is a timed run, so you have to make it back to the ship in time. However, I don't think I've ever seen anyone struggle with doing that, as you're given like 3 to 4 minutes. There will be Void Reavers and similar attacks to his revolving door attack popping up, so you'll have to dodge a couple of things. However, these attacks are pretty telegraphed, so it shouldn't be that difficult to dodge. Just don't fall off the edge and you'll be solid. Once you reach the ship and get into the ship, the game will end and you will see a final cutscene. If you haven't already, you will have unlocked Captain. And if you've done it on Monsoon difficulty, you will actually have unlocked the Purity as well. Now let's talk about the items, the most juiciest part. First off, if we're going to talk about items, we need to talk about increased player agency with these items. So we have a whole new mechanic which is called scrapping. Scrapping is done by finding a scrapper on a level and turning every item that you want into scrap. Scrap is then prioritized in 3D printers so you have more choice over what items you have. Don't like the stun grenades in your inventory, don't like the chrono baubles, it's okay, you can scrap them, and then when you find a 3D printer, that scrap will be used first. So you no longer have to worry about risking your good items like an ATG or something, and instead you can just scrap in the hopes of finding a 3D printer that is superior to whatever item that you scrapped it for. Which, by the way, if you've ever seen a 3D printer, you know they're pretty rare. But in the 1.0 update, 3D printers will appear more often on all stages, 50% more, and 3D printers will cost less to spawn on all stages, 50% less. And the new scrapper, which is what you use to scrap, can now appear on all stages. For the 3D printers, usually this means that there will be several 3D printers on one stage. Honestly, it's rare to not see a 3D printer at all, whereas before it was rare to see a 3D printer. And for the scrapper changes, this means that it can appear on all stages. It does not mean that it will. Sometimes there will be 2 to 3 scrappers on one map, sometimes there will be no scrappers on one map. But it can always spawn on every map, so there's not a single map where a scrapper cannot spawn. Okay, so there is player agency and the items that have been added from that. Scrap and scrappers and 3D printers being improved. Let's now talk about the brand spanking new items that have come to Risk of Rain 2. First, we have scrap, which, goes from white, green, red, and yellow, and can be thrown into 3D printers. We also have 3 new boss items, the Molten Perforator, the Shatter Spleen, and the Mired Urn. So the Molten Perforator is basically what the magma worms shoot off when they're, magma worming around. It's kind of like an ATG, as it has a 10% chance to proc 3 molten balls of lava. They don't seek out, so they're inferior to the ATG, but it's still a neato boss item. The Shatter Spleen is one of the best items in the game, and you get it from the Imp. It adds a hidden 5% crit chance, and every crit that you hit lands a bleed on that enemy. This bleed is actually separate from Tri-Tip Dagger bleed, which means you can get double the bleed. Also, any bleeding enemy explodes, dealing a certain percent of damage, while also dealing a certain percent of that enemy's HP as damage. So it's a single target and AoE item, all for the cost of one simple boss. The Mired Urn comes from the Clay Dune Strider, and it's essentially just a constant suck attack. Where the Clay Dune Strider goes down and then it starts sucking in everything? It's basically that. It deals 100% damage and heals you for that. The range isn't nearly as far as the Clay Dune Striders, and it only affects 1 enemy per stack, but it is a nifty little regen item that also does some damage. We also have 3 new lunar items, the Defiant Gorge, the Mercurial Rachis, and the Purity. I have an entire video on the Purity, you can go check that out, top right. But essentially it is the anti-57 leaf clover. It decreases your luck, which in turn decreases your chance to proc certain items. In exchange, you get -2 second cooldowns on all of your abilities. Again, I go over this in the video, but there are a bunch of survivors where this is good, and there are some where it's just terrible. The Defiant Gouge, I just realized it's Gouge and not Gorge, and I'm not going to re-record, so makes it so that every time you hit a shrine of any form, you will summon big bad boy enemies. It'll be essentially like hitting a combat shrine. The more of these you stack, the harder the enemies are going to be, and it always scales with time. So you can't get one stack of it and expect beetles on the 10th stage. More like once you hit the 10th stage, you start summoning blazing elites. And also, when I mean shrine, I mean literally every shrine. So, Shrine of Chance, you know, the things that usually don't give you items when you hit it 5 times in a row? Well, if you have this item, every time you miss, you're still going to be summoning things. Makes it pretty difficult to use those shrines, but you know, it's a good item if you need money early on. And finally, the Mercurial Rachis, or Roches if you want to pronounce it correctly. This randomly creates an AoE, upon which standing inside the AoE, you will deal 50% increased damage. The trade-off being is that enemies can also stand inside of it for an increased 50% damage. Stacking more just increases the AoE and not the damage. And finally, 3 new equipment. We have the Supermassive Leech, the Gorag's Opus, and the Forgive Me Please. The Supermassive Leech is one of the few items in the game that gives you direct lifesteal. Once you activate it, you will heal 40% of the damage you deal. Very few items in the game do this, and I think there's only one other that doesn't really give you that much. I think it might just be the Mired Urn. But essentially, if you deal 1,000 damage, you'll be healing based off of that damage instead of like a Harvester Scythe giving you just a flat 4 health. In other words, this is the best lifesteal item in the game. Gorag's Opus instead makes you and your allies go into a frenzy, moving faster and attacking faster for the duration. And when I say allies, I mean anyone in a multiplayer game will also get the bonus, and if you have any form of turrets or something like that, it will also increase their attack speed and move speed. Finally, the Forgive Me Please is like a voodoo doll that once thrown will activate all of your on-kill effects. There are actually more of these than you'd think, however, it does literally nothing if you have no on-kill effects. Actually, that's not true. It can spawn a lunar coin, but you have to be really lucky for that to happen. So going down some of the list of on-kill items, we have the Will of the Wisp, we have the Gasoline, we have Bandolier, we have Gore's Tome, Ceremonial Daggers, etc, etc. The Forgive Me Please used to have a bug or weird interaction where with the Forgive Me Please you could proc the Soulbound Catalyst. The Soulbound Catalyst is an on-kill effect which reduces your equipment cooldown by 4 seconds. You can probably see where I'm going with this. It would basically refresh the cooldown on the Forgive Me Please, and you could have hundreds and spawn hundreds out at one time. Now you can only have a maximum of 3 Forgive Me Pleases out on the field at once. So don't try to get too creative. Those are the new items. Let's talk about old items that got changed a little bit. Monster Teeth and Medkit now heal you for a % of maximum health rather than just the flat bonus that they used to, which makes them scale a lot better. War Banner now drops when activating the teleporter, so it's not completely useless as long as you always manage to activate the teleporter. The old Guillotine, you know, the item that kills elites, its execute threshold was nerfed because elites were nerfed at the same time. It now has only a 13% kill threshold rather than its 20% that it used to. Alright, so now for the major big boy change of the update. Reynald's and Kajaro's band. These 2 wedding bands that you stole from the Geico Geckos used to be on-hit effects. So every hit, you used to have an 8% chance to proc this item, and it would do a Fire Blast or a Ice Blast depending on which one you had. Now, instead of being an on-hit effect that, you know, takes a % chance to happen, it will always happen if you do over 400% or greater damage. What this means is that the Kajaros and Reynolds is more consistent. The trade-off to this is that there is now a 10-second cooldown on both of them. Now, when I say it only procs when you do 400% damage, this means the attack itself has to be able to do 400% damage. So for example, the Commando's double tap only does 90% damage. Even if you crit, even if you did a whole bunch of other things to increase the damage of that double tap, it will never be able to proc Reynolds or Kajaros, even if it did 400% total damage. Instead, whatever proccing it has to deal above 400% damage. So think Loader's Thunder Gauntlet. It does 1,000% damage. That will count. You might be thinking to yourself, okay, but aren't there survivors without an ability to proc this? And yes, if the Commando does not have frag grenades, he cannot proc Reynolds or Kajaros. So the one way to counteract this is that items can actually proc it. The most popular way of proccing these items is getting 2 ATGs, and then your ATGs will be able to proc it. Regardless of whatever procs the ATGs, they will be able to do 600% damage and therefore proc the Reynolds and Kajaros. Reynolds and Kajaros are technically better than what they used to be. They are guaranteed, and since you're only doing them on high damage hits, the 300 to 250% damage that they both do will be multiplying the already heinous damage of the 400%. So in the case of the ATG, the 600% damage that it does will then be multiplied by the 250% damage. This leads to Reynolds and Kajaros being absolutely absurd when paired with high damage abilities. So not only are they kind of better now, they are more consistent, the only downside being there is a 10-second cooldown. Which, a little trick if you don't know, is that the Blast Shower actually removes debuffs and Reynolds and Kajaros cooldown counts as a debuff. So you can use a Blast Shower to reset the cooldown of your Reynolds and Kajaros. If you have a Gesture of the Drowned or a bunch of fuel cells that can reduce the Blast Shower's cooldown below 10 seconds, you can almost negate Reynolds and Kajaros' downside. This is a viable strat to run with Loader or anyone with abilities that can consistently proc Reynolds and Kajaros anytime they want. So pro tip, if you ever want to go completely nutty on your run, try to go for a Blast Shower and Reynolds and Kajaros and just watch heads fly. Now, the last thing I want to say is that the Tri-Tip Dagger hasn't been changed, however, it is now one of the best items in the game. The only thing that changed about the item is that bleeds were changed. This means that you can refresh bleeds as much as you want and you can have insane amounts of bleed. This makes the Tri-Tip Dagger go from a lackluster DPS item to one of the best DPS items in the game. The bleed only does about 240% damage, but once you have 100 times 240% damage per second, that's a lot of damage. Again, it hasn't changed other than the bleed change, but I just wanted to mention that here so nobody got it twisted. Okay, so that's it for the item changes. I want to wrap up the entire video with talking about Eclipse. Eclipse is a new gameplay mode similar to Prismatic Trials, but other than that, it shares no similarities. It's just a normal run, however it is more difficult and the end game of it is to kill Mithrix. Every time you beat the game, aka beat Mithrix, a modifier gets added which makes the game even harder. Eclipse 1, you start at 50% health every stage. Eclipse 2, you get a teleporter radius decrease of 50%. Eclipse 3, your ally fall damage is 100% and lethal. 4, enemy speed plus 40%, and it goes on and on like this. This is a solo game mode, which means you can only play it by yourself. No friends for this one. There is really no benefit to playing Eclipse other than just for the challenge. There are currently no achievements, no skins, no anything for playing the game mode. That being said, you can still unlock things that you could in Monsoon on Eclipse, it's just you won't get any extras for it. Eclipse is just a way for players who are already rolling through Monsoon to face a little bit more of a challenge. I will be releasing an Eclipse guide pretty soon, but for now you're just gonna have to go in and experience it yourself. You can find it in alternate game modes, it'll be there with Prismatic Trials. I think that's about it for the console changes. I really hope I didn't miss anything, but that's everything you should be expecting for the 1.0 update on console. Having experienced the entire patch on PC already, I can't answer any other questions you might have, but that's about it. Hope you enjoyed, and we'll talk to you later.